Bom dia. Bom, tive a responsabilidade, né, de coordenar então a mediação dessa mesa, que é uma mesa que vai tratar um pouquinho sobre política, democracia, eleições e governança. Então eu chamo para fazer parte dessa mesa o professor Leach, da Swinburne University, o professor Feijó, da Universidade de Lisboa, Universidade de Ucoimbra, Sue Ingram, da Australian National University, e James Scamberry, da Australian National University também. Eu vou apresentar todos, primeiramente. I will present you first, if you want to come to the table, yeah? So I will present you to the public, then I will coordinate the time of each one, okay? James, Rui? Let's go. So, Michael Leach, então, é professor de Política e Relações Internacionais do Departamento de Educação e Ciências Sociais. Ele trabalha com política comparada e principalmente especialista na região do Pacífico, né? As pesquisas sobre construção do Estado na região da Ásia do Pacífico, com interesse especial em Timor-Leste. Trabalhou em diversas universidades e atualmente trabalha na Swinburne University of Technology e é também dos coordenadores da TLSA. Professor Feijó, da Universidade de Lisboa e da Universidade de Ucoimbra, formado em História pela Universidade de Ucoimbra e teve o seu doutorado em Oxford. Também trabalha com temas sobre a democracia, principalmente relacionados, então, com o Timor-Leste. Processos de análise de identidade, de construção da democracia no Timor e tem atuado também como consultor da Presidência da República de Timor-Leste e também tem diversos livros publicados sobre os temas. Sue Ingram tem experiência também em política pública, em construção do Estado e construção da paz, peacebuilding, relações internacionais, e também trabalhou junto com o governo australiano, junto com a ONU, nos projetos de peacekeeping, construção da paz, para Timor-Leste. Seu trabalho sobre regiões em pós-conflito, comparando então Timor-Leste e Bougainville. E o professor James, também da Australian National University, trabalha com questões de crime organizado, gangues, a questão de segurança, política econômica, e tem diversos trabalhos sobre o aspecto de imigração rural, urbana e assentamentos em Timor-Leste. Também trabalhou como consultor do Banco Mundial, da Unesco, da Asia Foundation e da UNDP. Então nós iniciamos com o professor Michael Leach. À vontade.
Obrigado. Vou apresentar em inglês, hoje é mais pelo primeiro tenho muitas palavras em português. Quero parabenizar a Kelly e o Daniel para organizar uma conferência magnífica aqui da TLSA. A nossos agradecimentos a vocês dois, porque na minha opinião, é um exemplo perfeito da filosofia da TLSA. É muito inclusiva, há espaço para muitas línguas. É importante para esta associação que, apesar do papel centro do inglês no mundo acadêmico, que temos espaço para os outros idiomas, especialmente os idiomas, línguas oficiais de Timor-Leste. Então, brigadinhos. Porque esta conferencia, no, en serio, esta conferencia es un ejemplo perfecto de las mías esperanzas para esta asociación. Entonces, obrigado. Iria apresentar em português, mas tive à noite muitos desafios técnicos. Então, não tive espaço para preparar o meu português para esta apresentação complexa, porque há muitos dados aqui. Então, com as suas permissões, eu vou continuar em inglês. So, this is a paper that is about my studies, my surveys of East Timorese tertiary students, which I have done since the restoration of independence in 2002. What you will see today is the most recent data. If you've seen this survey before, I did a survey last July in Timor-Leste, in Dili. And so this is the inaugural outing of the new data, if you're interested in that sort of thing. No? Yes. Okay. For some reason I left the word Melanesia there. I had a project that was comparative. This is only about Timor-Leste. And you can see I've done the surveys in all these years. Today I will show you 2002, 2007, 2017. And this is not a popular survey. It's not even a survey of youth. It's a survey of a particular group, but they're an important group because they're the likely future leaders in Timor-Leste. And I can now track some longitudinal changes in this data and give voice to student perspectives and hopefully get a more nuanced understanding of nation building. So, I've just made these points. The good thing about students in Dili is they come from all over the country, so you do get a geographically representative group. And I asked them certain demographic questions first. That allows me to do associations and crosstabs later using the magic of SPSS. Because I'm a shallow empiricist. Thank you. You're welcome. Yeah. So age, gender, district of origin and language proficiencies, and then I'm able to associate those with particular attitudes to see if there is a strong association or a weak one or none at all. This can be, it's called cross-tabbing, and you can assess things like regional or gendered differences in attitudes, and I'll show you a couple of cool ones today. But it also shows how cultural or linguistic affiliations inform attitudes to national identity. So I've got a few series of questions. The first is affiliations. How close or emotionally attached do you feel to your aldea, your super, to your district and sub-districts, to Timor-Leste, to Southeast Asia, Melanesia, and to other countries? Now I should say that we have to explain what Southeast Asia means to students. It's an English language term, yeah, or a European term. I don't know whether it's also Portuguese, yeah. And then we ask them these national identity questions. Now it's important to understand what's being asked here. Some people say the following things are important for being truly East Timorese. Others say they are not important. How important do you think each of the following is to being truly East Timorese? To have been born in East Timor, Timor-Leste, to have East Timorese citizenship, to have lived in Timor-Leste for most of one's life, to be able to speak Tetum Dili, to be able to speak Portuguese, obviously the official languages, to be Catholic, to respect tradition and adat, to respect Timor-Leste's political institutions and laws, or to feel East Timorese. Now, as you can probably tell, there's a mix of different types of questions there. Some are ascriptive and some are voluntarist, and what that means is you can't help whether you were born in Timor-Leste or not, it's just a fact about you. Whereas feeling East Timorese is something you could become over time, potentially, by becoming a citizen. You have some choice in that, whereas you don't generally have choice about the ascriptive factors. Becoming a citizen, though, is a voluntarist one. etc. Then I asked them some indicators of national pride. How proud are you of Timor-Leste in the following? The way democracy works, its distinctive culture, Timor-Leste's history, and its fair and equal treatment of all groups in society. And of course I can cross-tab that with gender or district of origin, and that has been at times very interesting. Other data, I've got a lot of other data, but the one I'll show you today is this one. Who should resolve disputes over land ownership, disputes between neighbours, crimes against property, crimes against the person? Because when those issues occur in someone's life, it's a really important measure of what you consider your real political community to be. I have a problem now, where am I going to? Am I going to the traditional authorities or am I going to the police? Oops. So let's look at some data. So first we find out about the students. Now see at the bottom here, I have 5 surveys, but I'm only showing you the original one in 2002, post-crisis 2007, and last July 2017. I do have other surveys in the middle if you're interested. So here's people's self-identified proficiency in Tetum Dili. Now I'll tell you an interesting thing. The surveys were originally in Indonesian back in 2002, and they were Indonesian all the way through to 2012, and 2017 came along and my staff in Dili were telling me it's over. We can't do these surveys in Indonesian. Their Indonesian is too poor. So 2017 was the first time the survey was in Tetum. And I think it did give people a sense as they read it of, maybe my Tetum's not so fantastic after all, when they saw it written. So there's just a slight dip there, and that's my theory of what happened. Yeah, I don't think people's Tetum has got worse. In any case, red means moderate. You know. So there's Tetum Dili. Now this is interesting. There's Portuguese. Now way back in 2002, only 2.5% said they were fluent, although 24 said they had moderate fluency. This increased, and now in 2017, 15% of my respondents said they were fluent in Portuguese. Now these are tertiary students in Dili. Now obviously that's a low figure, given that they're tertiary students in Dili, but it's also an improvement on the past. And of course you've got 60% there saying that they have moderate fluency. So that's interesting. Now let's go on to Indonesia and look at this. So that was 2002, 2007, still very strong, and it's now 24.5% believe they are fluent in Indonesian, although the moderate fluency is still very high. English hasn't really changed a lot over the time. It's not subject to language policy in the same way. So there you go, that's been pretty constant. All right. Now this is a different question. What languages do you speak when you are at home? Language Nakasa. What do you speak when you are at home? This is a different question. And what these numbers mean is that at least some of the time, this language is spoken in my house, back home. Okay? And so you see that Tetum's very strong, remains strong the whole time. Indonesia has dropped enormously over that period. The use of Indonesian in the household has dropped significantly over that 15-year period. Bearing in mind, these are tertiary students in Timor-Leste. This is not a popular survey. This is a particular group, but they're likely future leaders, one would presume. Portuguese increased between 2002 and 2007 and stayed pretty constant, and you can imagine that young kids are coming home and speaking some Portuguese. It doesn't mean people are speaking Portuguese all day long in the house. It just means that sometimes Portuguese is a language that is spoken in our house. And English. Now from my focus groups, I know that tends to be siblings who speak English practicing with one another, who are students. Another Timorese language, that has stayed very strong that whole period. So 2/3 of them speak a Timorese language that is not Tetum in the house regularly. This is another question that's very interesting. And I've got a feeling that James might have suggested this one to me once. It might have been you, yeah. It was a good idea. And this is, what language do you find the easiest written language? And I think there's a different question that's quite interesting. And they were able to put down 3 in cardinal order. And so obviously Tetum is the easiest for 70%. 10% said that the easiest was Portuguese. And that's stronger than the previous survey, but still low, of course. And then 40% put it second. Indonesian has quite collapsed in that regard as the easiest language to write in. And now it's down around 7 or 8%. And so, yeah, it's interesting. All right, now we're looking at affiliations. How close or emotionally connected do you feel to different levels of political community? And what you'll see is if you add the blue and the red together, and this is the old form of Excel from 2002, you'll see the peaks are here at neighbourhood, no surprise, and the nation. Neighbourhood and the nation are the ones that they feel closest to Timorese students. And the intervening subnational, district and sub-district are somewhat lower. But after the crisis, oh geez, 5 minutes, straight. All right. After the crisis, these levels went up slightly. But you see, it's neighbourhood and nation. This is the most recent survey, and it's the same. Neighbourhood and nation, it's like a U shape, tend to be the ones that Timorese students feel closest to. What's interesting over here is, to the extent that they feel a sort of supranational affiliation, it's to Southeast Asia rather than Melanesia, because Timor is that sort of border state between those two zones. Here are the national identity questions. The importance of these things to being truly East Timorese. Having been born in East Timor, always very high. Being a citizen of East Timor, relatively high. Here we go. Having lived in Timor all of one's life is not as high. Because these are students, they're young people, they like to travel, they like to go overseas. They do not think it's as important to live in Timor your entire life to be truly East Timorese. That's not as strong. The importance of Tetum language ability to being truly East Timorese, that's very, very high. The importance of speaking Portuguese to being truly East Timorese, more controversial, but less controversial than it was in 2002. So obviously that's a controversial indicator, but not nearly as controversial as it was back in 2002 when everyone was talking about that one. And you can see that it's increased even from 2007. The importance of being Catholic to being truly East Timorese, very strong, but moderating slightly there. 74.5. Now I want you to remember that number, 74.5, as we look at the importance of respecting tradition and adat. 84.5. So even in a strongly Catholic nation of Timor-Leste, and even among this group, which is among the most modern in the whole society, these are students living in Dili, young people engaging with global and international cultures. Even this group believes that respecting tradition and adat, they very strongly believe, is an important indicator of being truly East Timorese. And there's it in a table form, and here's the very important. You see, not so important to have lived in East Timor your whole life. Portuguese, controversial, but less so than it was in the past. And here you see tradition right up there with these modern indicators of respecting the law and feeling East Timorese, right up there. And in fact, being Catholic is a little bit less important, although still important. National pride. How proud are you of East Timor's history? This is always the strongest of the four because Timor fought for its independence and has a very strong sense of national history, and this is quite important to ideas of national identity, as we all know. How proud are you of East Timor's distinctive culture? Also strong, not as strong as history, but strong. How proud are you of the way democracy works in Timor? A bit up and down. Now, There it was in 2002. Then post-crisis, that collapsed. I took this survey in July last year before the first election. I believe this will be lower now. If I was to take this today, it would drop again. This was before the July election last year, in early July, and of course there's been another election since. I suspect you wouldn't get a result like this today. How proud are you of East Timor's fair and equal treatment of all groups in society? This one is interesting, it never recovered from the crisis. This one did not recover. It was high in 2002, and it's been like this ever since. It just didn't recover from the 2006 crisis, this measure. This one is really interesting. It's a kind of a complicated question, so if English is not your first language, to sort of focus on it. It's asking two different attitudes. Some people say it's better for a nation if different ethnic groups maintain their distinct languages, customs and traditions. Others say it's better if these groups adapt and blend into one society. These are two different ideas of a nation. One is a kind of unity and diversity model where we celebrate diversity but we're all part of one nation. And the other is a culturally integrationist idea that it's better to actually leave those things behind in terms of your place in the nation, or cohabit with them, but to form one national culture. Now, I'm putting in my comparative studies because Melanesia is the example par excellence of the form of view that of many cultures. And you see that Timor never really has been as strong in that view as Melanesia, and it's dropping as well amongst this cohort. This cohort is moving more towards a culturally integrationist view. Although there's still a majority for the form of view. So that's interesting. The end. All right, well, I'll skip through some things here. People moving to the cities and towns causes social problems. People are getting less worried about that. But that, ironically, they also think people should stay in the areas where they grow up, like presumably other people should. Not them. Yeah. In summary, look, I'll show you this one thing. That's from 2007. People from the West in 2007 were much more likely to say it was important to have lived in Timor all of your life, because there was that debate at the time about diaspora figures coming back, and they hadn't been in Timor and so on and so on. And that was associated with region of origin, but I have never found anything else in my data that suggests there's a difference in attitudes between people from the East or the West, Lower Salo and I've never found anything else. Just that one. And you can see that one is political. That's to do with the urban politics of Dili. It's not some difference in attitudes among Timorese that's ethnic or something. Just show you this one. It's very interesting. This is from 2010, so it's still got international police. I haven't actually processed this data yet. But what I want to show you is this. The difference between men and women on who should resolve land disputes. And you'll see that men are more likely to say that the traditional leaders should do it than women. That's a very significant difference, by the way. Why is that? Well, you can assume it's because those traditional power structures are male-dominated. Well, one might hypothesise that. And the same for who should resolve disputes between neighbours. Men 10% more likely to say it should be traditional leaders than women. I am just about finished, but this is really interesting, I think, in terms of the politics of East Timor. I asked the students some state-building priorities. This is different to nation-building. And look what they said. Improving health and education are the big ones. The government, though, is focused on improving infrastructure and roads. And look, the students just don't agree that those are priorities. They just don't agree. It's education and health. Now, in the third priority, they're like, yes. And you could probably add in some of that improving communication between different areas. When you look at the most important, even if you added them together, it's very, very low. Students want health and education spending. So that's all I believe I want to say, except this one's very interesting. How willing would you be to leave East Timor if it could improve your life chances? And 2002, 49% of this group said that they'd be very willing. 2007, that went up to 61 after the crisis. And now it's only 20%. That's quite low. That's a sign of optimism, I think, from the Timorese students. Muito obrigado.
Então, bom dia a todos. Queria começar também por felicitar a Kelly, o Daniel e toda a equipa tão simpática que organizou e nos tem tratado de uma maneira tão excelente nesta enorme reunião dos amigos de Timor-Leste em Brasília. Considerando que estamos aqui numa situação plurilinguística, por facilidade, eu lembro-me sempre de um escritor que dizia que Portugal e o Brasil são dois países irmãos separados pela mesma língua. E a maneira como nós falamos português e os brasileiros falam português é um bocadinho diferente. E eu optei por fazer a minha apresentação em inglês, embora vocês vão vendo um PowerPoint em português. Vamos ver se funciona. Queria também dizer que a minha presença aqui deve-se à generosidade da instituição a que eu pertenço, em Ucoimbra, o Centro de Estudos Sociais da Universidade de Coimbra, que generosamente financiou a minha vinda cá. So I start with an epigraph by our friend, I think I can say he's a friend of all of us, Jorge Trindade. Timor-Leste was like a social laboratory in which the lives of almost 1 million people were the object of experiment, forcing them to swallow modern concepts and ideas without allowing them the time required to digest them adequately. I think this sums up what has happened in Timor after independence. Timor-Leste took 2 critical decisions. Okay. Eu é que faço isso? Okay. Timor-Leste took 2 critical decisions. To build simultaneously a state apparatus, a state administration after the collapse of the Indonesian administration, and a democratic polity. They have to build a democratic state, and these 2 words means 2 different programs. And they also took the decision to build a multi-level state with ample room for subnational administration and grassroots democracy. It is inscribed in the Constitution. My talk will only address the problems of building democratic local governance. But 2 colleagues have written a very interesting piece called "Do All Things Go Together? All Good Things Go Together? Conflicting Objectives in Democracy Promotion." And when you are talking about state building and democracy building, there are areas of conflict. For instance, when you're talking about municipalities, are they going to be totally controlled by the central state, as they are right now, or is there power to be devolved to the communities to elect and have some say over the organization of municipalities. After 15 years, we still don't know exactly what the model is. The only level at which local organization is functioning is suqua aldeia. The municipalities will not be considered in this context. So, but what is democracy? What we mean by democracy? I take the view that more than the formalities, democracy is a governance system characterized by the existence of a plurality of organisms discharging specific functions for a limited time span and subject to a double process of accountability. Horizontal, sharing power and accepting it is going to be monitored, and vertical, tying those in office to the delegation of power emanating from citizens. Democracy is therefore a mechanism to generate legitimacy and to empower citizens to exercise self-determination. It is based on two very old, coming from the time of Athenian democracy in the 5th century before Christ, so 2,500 years ago, called isonomia and isegoria, the equality of political rights for all and the equality of all to the freedom of speech. These are the bases of democracy. It also ensures, and this is an important thing, an important element to bear in mind, democracy ensures that this dissent can be organized. It's not enough that you yourself diverge from the government, it's that you can organize dissent and challenge collectively who's in power. So I come to Joanna Wallis, whom I met for the first time in Canberra 2 or 3 weeks ago, who wrote that while they are not necessarily democratic, local institutions in Timor-Leste can be highly legitimate. So this is a problem. People can feel that they have legitimate institutions, and we can analyze them and say, but they are not democratic. For our minds, living in democracies, this is a strange problem. We think of democracy as a way of legitimizing, and without democracy you don't have legitimate power. But in many societies you can have legitimate institutions without really having democratic. Max Weber famously put it 100 years ago that there is legal rational legitimacy, charismatic legitimacy, and traditional legitimacy, which is a system in which authority is legitimate because it has always been like this. This historical repetition of generations is enough to legitimize a particular society, a particular form of power. But Timor-Leste traditional power is highly hierarchical and class or status restrictive. It is gender exclusive. It is youth exclusive. And it is based on the principle that consensus have to be solved, and once solved, there will be no opposition to its implementation. So the right of dissent is limited to the moment in which we reach a decision. This is significantly different from what we understand in the West by democratic system. Next. In Timor-Leste, there were two contrasting views immediately after independence. One was people came and wrote about ground zero, tabula rasa, terra nullius, empty shell, notions that the idea these people had was that legitimacy had evaporated in Timor. the notion of legitimacy had evaporated. There were no structures, no power structures, and no legitimacy. They had completely, and so they saw what happened as a schism, to come to the terms of our conference. But other people, dear friend David Hicks, spoke of the resurgence of custom. Bovenzieken, customary revival. Andrea Molnar, re-traditionalization of power relations. Jim Fox, few commentators expected this reaffirmation of local tradition to emerge. So, what we have here is a completely opposite view, is that in spite of the collapse of the administration, there were structures of legitimacy, there were structures of power who were legitimate in the eyes of the Timorese. And therefore, we have an idea of continuity. Renewal in this process of continuity. What happened? The first attempt at creation of local government, I come to briefly a conclusion, was a disaster. The UNTAC, with the aid of the World Bank, created the so-called Community Empowerment and Local Governments Project, which they envisaged as the seeds for future local administration. But they imposed a complete rupture with notions of legitimacy. They imposed gender parity. They excluded traditional leaders from the possibility of being elected. And Tanya Hohi came to the conclusion and wrote several pieces, including a very good PhD dissertation. She called this the clash of paradigms. They were trying to impose a model which was running against many of the legitimacy issues still alive in Timorese society. It was put aside after independence. The Constitution creates local government in a democratic way. In section 2.4, the Constitution says the states shall recognize and value the norms and customs of East Timor that are not contrary to the Constitution and to any legislation dealing specifically with customary law. So this is a very broad understanding of the need to pay attention to continuities in Timorese society. There was 3 elections for Suku councils and Chefe Suku and Chefe Aldeia, 2004 and 5, 2009 and 16. Each one had its specific legal framework, which has been evolving, and I won't go into detail. But one is constant, is that Suku authorities are not to be considered the lowest grade of state administration. So they are still somewhat fearful of what it means to entrust state power to Chefe Suku. Their powers are mostly those of traditional leaders, and even if their competencies have been increased recently, they come mostly under the umbrella of advisory competencies. They can advise the district administrator to build a school or to build a road, but they cannot impose that the use of the money allocated is going here or going there. They are mostly advisory. It's 15 minutes that we said, I believe. The creation of local governance, the formal model combines features of a modern liberal democracy, universal suffrage with equal rights for all, time-limited mandates, gender and age quotas, majority rule with respect from minority or minorities' rights, whereas they still have forms of traditional legitimacy. There is the co-optation of Leonines to join the Conselho Suco, and the Conselho Suco is therefore composed of elected people and people who represent traditional forms of legitimacy. Mike and Debbie Cummins have shown that a few years ago there you could see basically three different models operating. The co-incumbency divided in co-inheritance, where the traditional URI is pressed by the locals to enter the race and wins. So you have the accumulation in one person of traditional and modern legitimacy. The traditional house candidate, the URI doesn't stand but indicates his son, his nephew, one of his relatives, and he wins. And a model they call authorization, where someone who is not a URI or member of the ruling house seeks office and negotiates symbolic support from the URI. Out of these, other possibilities work wrongly. They were failed. They generate conflict. These were the three ways of combining, let's use the word, the two sources of legitimacy. Recent developments. Elections in Los Palos. Incumbent Chefe Suco re-elected 16. But Chefe Suco elected for the first time 18. You have it even. Okay? Elected Chefe Suco who had lost previous elections 3. So what you have here is that there has been an evolution within the system. It seems that the system is establishing itself and it's getting some more weight to the modern form of legitimation. One example is Moapitin. The incumbent was a guerrilla fighter. He did not seek re-election. He had other business to attend to, but supported and tried to impose his own candidate and failed. The second round of the elections was disputed between an engineer and a teacher, both of whom lived in the city of Los Palos. So they were people from the village, from the Suco, but they were living in Los Palos and they had education. They were regarded as more able to apply those advisory powers and to secure more things for the village than other traditional leaders would in this more complex combination of power layers in Timor-Leste. How to interpret local government's experiments. This is 3 slides, I think, and it will be over. One is to go back to Tanya Hoey and say that traditional political concepts, sometimes labeled local democratic, often differ fundamentally from concepts underpinning Westminster-style institutions. Some of the principal local values even run counter to Western democratic principles. And David also wrote a few years ago that neoliberal ideas are both alien and inconsistent with Lisa, and therefore there would be a clash, there would be a contradiction between democratic principles on the one hand and Lisa and tradition on the other. Many people have proposed the concept of hybridity. Hybridity is the transmutation of both liberal and the local forms of legitimacy. Or political hybridity is the coexistence of introduced Western models of governance and local governance practices rooted in place and culture and enjoying widespread social legitimacy. I take that this is an interesting and important way of looking at what is happening, but we must be aware of all its implications. Hybridity is a metaphor from the natural world and would imply the creation of a new entity which is, or is not, capable of reproducing itself as one expects from a political system. It also posits a convergence of experiments to form a stable model. The idea of hybridity is that with flour, which is one part of the cake, and with sugar you make a cake, which is not sugar, not flour, but something different, something else. And this something else has got structural features which are permanent and is capable of reproducing. That is what hybridity, taken literally, would mean. In very general terms, one might say that ever since the Portuguese set foot in Timor, there has been several forms of hybridity to account for the interplay between the two. And if we extend the concept of hybridity to these lengths, it becomes really not extremely useful. It covers so many things as to explain very little. What Susanna and I have been proposing is the concept of cohabitation. Post-colonial societies can be regarded as accommodating distinctive and well-structured social-cultural systems that interact in a dynamic form. These systems entertain complex relations with one another and all evolve due to the reciprocal influences exercised in the historical process without losing their identity and without creating some new structured form. It's all about dialogue between modernity and tradition, Lisan and Catholic Church. You have a number of things who keep their identities but dialogue and are very flexible in the solutions they propose. So the summary of the difference between hybridity and cohabitation is that hybridity considers that between two well-structured models, traditional, modern, or whatever you can put in here, a new model emerges with a clear identity and capacity to reproduce itself over time. What cohabitation considers is that there are two, perhaps more, well-defined models which intertwine and allow for negotiations from which emerge solutions that are not structurally fixed nor capable of self-reproduction. You have to always go back to the sources and to the flour and the sugar and forget that there is a cake. There are several possibilities of using it. And I will have another slide, but I stop here. I will come back to it if needed. Thank you so much for your attention.
Obrigada, professora Rui. Seguimos então com a professora Su. Su, please.
I realised listening to Rui's presentation that this one is going to be very complimentary. And I was also struck by the fact that the people quoted who were talking about empty shell or tabula rasa in Timor were all political scientists. The people who were talking about the local political culture, the presence of all the informal institutions driving the political dynamic in Timor were anthropologists. So it's an interesting dichotomy. And I guess being claimed in a certain way to be a partial both. This is the worldview that I've brought to this presentation. So the focus I'm talking about is the tension between liberal peacebuilding and local political culture in Timor-Leste. And I'm viewing this for this presentation through the prism of party politics. And the argument I'm making, and having been very much part of the UN transitional administration myself, is that the efforts of that transitional administration in East Timor to entrench multi-party democracy really come across the interests of two quite distinct and opposing political forces in Timor-Leste. The first was Shanana Bushmorel, who was the leader of the National Council for Timorese Resistance, CNRT, and who was deeply suspicious of party politics throughout his political history up to that point when UNTET was formed. And the second force was Fretilin, which was the dominant political party in Timor at the time, and which was really seeking majoritarian power. It wanted to run government. So the analysis that I'm setting out here was really kicked off by my own experience working inside UNTET, and I was sharply aware of the clash of paradigms between the UN and the local political culture, and again I'm borrowing the language of Tanya Jorge because I think she captured the problem exquisitely. And so that's really the starting point for the analysis that I'm setting out here. The UNTET mission was set up when liberal peacebuilding, the concept of liberal peacebuilding, was at its height. The approach of liberal peacebuilding emerged quite early in the 1990s, and there were two important factors that contributed to this development. The first was the increasingly intra-state character of conflict, rather than conflict between states. The pattern of conflict was very much within states. And the second really important factor was the new dynamic in the UN Security Council that came about with the end of the Cold War, because that really ushered in what became an extended period of cooperation between the permanent members of the Security Council, and importantly between the US and Russia. So over this period, the Security Council expanded the scope of peacekeeping mandates. They moved well beyond the earlier mandates, which were just about keeping the warring sides apart, and mandates increasingly focused on building the peace in conflict-affected countries. And so the basic template for peacekeeping, for peace building, it was very much about state building. It was about encouraging the development of liberal democracy and market-oriented economies. And Timor-Leste was very much a guinea pig for that approach. So this is what you saw happening in UNTET. This was its modus operandi. And it meant that UNTET was very wary of CNRT as an unelected coalition of interests, ruled over by one man, and it was unwilling to make CNRT its exclusive interlocutor. From the outset, it chose to engage with the spectrum of political interests in Timor-Leste, and once the initial stabilisation phase had been completed, and the mission began to focus on preparing the country for independence, UNTET set out very actively to promote political pluralism through political party discourse, and that led to the very rapid marginalisation and demise of CNRT. And a critical priority at this stage of the mission was to oversee the development of a constitution for the future state. And the way that UNTET went about this clearly demonstrates its commitment to embedding multi-party democracy. There were various options on the table for how to frame a constitution, or what process to follow to frame a constitution, but UNTET wanted to see it go through a constituent assembly, and it was very specific about the electoral model to form that assembly. It favoured electing an assembly through a single national constituency and using a closed party list. And the view was that this approach would actually maximise the chances of the smaller political parties getting a place in the Constituent Assembly, and the intent was to reduce the domination of Fretilin. And interestingly, the model meant that basically to be elected, you had to be part of a political party ticket. It was almost impossible for an independent candidate to make it into the Assembly. And then UNTET made one small concession to address the arguments that were being made in favour of district representation rather than a national constituency. it made provision in the final model for the Constituent Assembly for one representative to be elected from each of the 13 districts. And that mixed voting system actually produces the precise opposite of what UNTED had intended, and it gave a really generous free kick to Fretilin, because Fretilin got 57.3% of the national vote, but once it had swept up 12 of the 13 districts, and in reality 13, I won't count that, it ended up with 62.5% of the seats. So UNTED took great pride in the fact there were 12 parties which won seats in the Assembly, but it really was a Pyrrhic victory, because in concert with ASTD, a small party led by Xavier, Fretilin had the supermajority that it required to pass its constitution. And so, to get back to my argument, this philosophical commitment that UNTED had to multi-party democracy was really at odds with the two key political forces in Timor-Leste. Xanana Guzmán was deeply suspicious of partisan politics, and his approach was to build inclusive coalitions of actors, working above the partisan fray to provide political leadership, obviously with him in a key role. Fretilin, on the other hand, was a dominant political party on the ground, and under the leadership of Marielle Petiri, it was really determinedly pursuing majoritarian power. So let me now start to make that case. So I'll start with Xanana, and from the time that he assumed leadership of the resistance effort in early 1981, he really worked to make that resistance much more inclusive. He reached out to the church and he progressively shifted the characterization of the struggle for independence from an ideological struggle to a nationalist struggle. In 1987, he formally dissociated Falentil from any political party or political philosophy, and the following year he relinquished his own membership of Fretilin, and he argued that the independence struggle transcended political loyalties. The resistance was restructured, and the National Council of Mulberry Resistance was formed as an umbrella body for all interests that were supporting independence. And the language he used for the National Council of Mulberry Resistance, he described it as a civic organisation of political character, non-partisan, independent, and of weight. But during the transition to independence, Xanana Guzmán consciously chose to stand above partisan politics. Just months before the popular consultation on the territory's political future, he condemned those who were focused on achieving power for their party, rather than focusing on the interests of the homeland and the people of Timor. He repeatedly deplored the UN fixation on party politics. He delivered some blistering speeches on that topic, and he was hugely critical of this simplistic equation of party competition with democracy. He chose himself not to engage in the Constituent Assembly election or to endorse any party for that election. And then when the presidential election came round, he threatened not to stand because the way that UNTED had drafted the regulation covering the presidential election, it was pretty hard to separate oneself as a candidate from a party. He wanted to badge himself as a non-partisan candidate, seeking to represent a broad cohort of interests. In the end, to get around the problems of the regulatory drafting, he accepted nomination by 9 political parties, but he refused categorically to have any party symbols on the ballot paper. It would only be his name and photo that could be on the paper. And the negotiation at that point was that Xavier agreed also to portray his candidacy in the same way. So Xanana's fight for a non-partisan presidency was revived in 2007 because the Parliament passed a law providing for party symbols on the presidential ballot paper. And at that point, Xanana took that legislation to the Tribunal de Recurso, arguing that the provision to include party symbols was invalid. At that point, he was overruled by the Tribunal de Recurso and had to back down. But even where political institutions have embedded partisan affiliation, I think Schneider has always worked to get around that problem. When he decided to pursue the Prime Ministership in 2007, he bowed to the necessity of having a political party, he had to have a party, as a vehicle for his candidacy, and so he formed CNRT at that point. But I think his relationship with that party has always been basically pretty instrumental. He's always formed cross-party alliances and forged understandings with whatever party or parties would give him a parliamentary majority or would facilitate the passage of his programme and budget through Parliament. And this pragmatism, I think, was most evident when he stepped down from the Prime Ministership in 2015 and advised CNRT, his own party, and his other two coalition partners, that no one amongst them was really up to the job of being Prime Minister, and he turned instead to Fretilin. And again, that was a very pragmatic move, and quite recently, during the recent election campaign, he actually reflected publicly on his motive at that point, and he described his action as a political guerrilla action in order to control the Parliament. So you can see the way he operates with political parties. Fretilin is a very different story. It's approached the political game very differently, and it has a really strongly partisan identity, and has always sought paramountcy for the party. Back in 2000, it very smartly withdrew from the old CNRT, the National Council, and started campaigning at the village level for the Constituent Assembly elections, which were at that point still a year off. So it really stole the march on all the other political parties. And it marketed itself very, very smartly as a political party of the resistance. It said in its campaigning that it would sweep the ground with all the other parties. It used the language dasarai, a rather unfortunate term given the Indonesian history. And it adopted as its slogan, Fretilin is the people, and the people are Fretilin. And I've already mentioned it won a majority of seats in the Constituent Assembly, and that meant that it dominated the constitution-making process. So there was very little incentive to compromise on the provisions of the Constitution, and it meant that that Constitution wasn't embraced unanimously when it was passed through the Constituent Assembly, and it was widely perceived as a Fretilin artefact. The electoral win by Fretilin also meant that it dominated the Council of Ministers that was formed after the August 2001 election. And UNTED, of course, wanted a pluralist Council of Ministers, and technically it achieved it in terms of the number of people in the Council of Ministers, but Fretilin took all the significant jobs within that council. And Fretilin was also guaranteed, of course, an easy path to government after independence, because the Constitution provided that the Constituent Assembly would become the first Parliament. And so that ensured that Mari Alkatiri became Prime Minister and Luongo became President of the Parliament. And as Prime Minister, Alkatiri boasted that Fretilin would govern for 50 years. We know that was a hollow boast with subsequent developments. And I think we can say back in 2017 as well, in the process of formation of government after the July 2017 elections, that we saw Fretilin, or at least perhaps Alkatiri's majoritarian inclination, again at work in stitching together a coalition, or stitching an alliance government. He had a very narrow plurality of votes, but he immediately went into gear setting out to negotiate an alliance government, and I think probably a fairly unyielding stance on how to distribute the prizes of office, alienated potential alliance partners, and so we ended up with an unsustainable minority government and fresh elections. So, to conclude, I can see Camilla's getting nervous. UNTER's commitment to forging a multi-party democracy shifted the political landscape in Timor-Leste in significant ways. It certainly locked in political party competition as the basis for the formation of government, but I think it did less well on embedding pluralist representation and real representation of citizens in their parliament. The representational features of parliament produced on UNTER's watch were weak from the outset, and they've fallen away further since then. The number of political parties represented has reduced from 12 parties in 2002 to 10 in 2007 to 4 in 2012 and 5 in 2017. Interestingly, the last election rather bucks that system, as the parties themselves have learned how to game the process through pre-election coalition formation. And as we've seen, those two coalitions that got elected promptly broke down into their component parties again. Vote wastage has been really high under the electoral system that Timor has. It peaked at 20% of votes wasted in 2012, fell back to 14% in 2017. Although fascinatingly, 2018 has bucked that system again with under 4% of vote wastage. I think it's about 3%. 2.5. Wow. I should have checked my figures first. And so, also again, seemingly voters, like parties, have learned how to game the system and make their votes count. And then finally, the legislation that's been made since independence has eliminated district-level constituencies altogether and imposed a really rigid party discipline on MPs that binds them to their parties rather than to their constituents. So I guess in short, where that comes out is that over time, despite all of UNTER's best wishes and intentions and careful institutional design, the system has really adjusted itself to local Timorese interests. Thank you.
Vamos agora para a última fala da mesa, professor James.
So thanks again to Kelly, and Danielle and Anna and all the other organisers and volunteers in the conference. And also thanks to everyone for turning up on the last day. I also feel Mike has put me to shame. I see only about 3 or 4 Anglophone faces in the audience. But, so I wish I could also attempt something in Portuguese, but I won't embarrass myself. But I can, unlike Mike, I can propose marriage in Fataluku, so it's horrible. So today I'm going to talk about the 2017 elections. I'm not actually that interested in elections as such, but by the very localised dynamics that drive them. These dynamics in turn can tell us much about the logic of government policy and expenditure, the logic that produces white elephants like Tassie Mane, the explosion in veterans payments, and also the neglect of vital services such as agriculture and education. Timor-Leste held its 3rd parliamentary elections in July 2017. It was the first election whereby the 2 main parties, Fratelin and the CNRT, led by Jeanette Guzmão, were not bitter enemies, though many things stayed the same, such as the use of influential local figures, known as brokers, to mobilise blocks of followers. The CNRT had heavily invested in patronage politics, and this approach had worked in the previous election. It was therefore reasonable to think that the status quo would largely stay the same. Instead, they lost votes to a number of new smaller parties, I also found out just before the talk I've got much less time to talk than I thought, which is my own fault for not reading my emails properly. So apologies to the translators, and hopefully I'll get through everything. So these parties had nothing like the CNRT's resources, resulting in a Franklin victory. So why is it then that with so many resources at its disposal, why did the CNRT still lose? Unlike Franklin, the vanguard movement of the independence struggle, the CNRT was only created in 2007 as a personal political vehicle for Gusmao. The lack of a developed organisational base presented a major challenge to maintain or increase its vote, so recruiting influential brokers was essential to its electoral fortunes. However, it's not just about brokers, but about the distribution of resources. Why the CNRT failed to exploit the advantage of a decade of rule raises deeper questions about their relationship with the electorate. Why such patronage politics didn't translate into votes. This paper is based on fieldwork conducted between 2012 and 2016, but particularly an ANU project I was part of with Ed Aspinall on the 2017 parliamentary elections. We conducted interviews with party campaign workers, key brokers, and observed campaign events. We also partnered with the local NGO, Bellum, who have a nationwide network of volunteer conflict monitors to observe community-level political dynamics. We also recruited 4 national researchers to observe changing political dynamics in their sukus of origin and what the main influences were on voting patterns. Gratuitous Leach shot. So, even after 3 elections, in terms of voting behaviour, Timorese politics still has a largely communal nature. Networks of personal relationships and reciprocal exchange continue to be highly influential in voting behaviour. Harnessing these networks then through influential brokers has long been the key to electoral success. Voters are mobilised through traditional authorities and local or regional big men figures such as resistance veterans. As Andrew McWilliam has pointed out, clandestine resistance era networks often mesh with dissent group networks. So such resistance figures may possess dual authority. In return, there's a clear expectation that they will reciprocate in terms of jobs, contracts and local development projects. So this is what is generally understood as clientelism. So Timor held its first real parliamentary election in 2007. The CNRT campaigned hard on spending the oil money, not worshipping it as they call it, and its campaign featured lots of banners of glossy high-rises and freeways. This populist appeal, together with a range of other factors, proved to be a highly successful strategy. Once in power, they kept this promise. Government expenditure rose by 245%, mainly on infrastructure such as roads and a national electricity grid, although, as a series of reports found, much of the spending was overpriced and ineffective. Translators have given up, I think. Oh no. It was a highly centralised system, with Gusmao at its apex, surrounded by a circle of largely unelected confidants, with links to foreign contractors, mostly Indonesian. They also launched a number of contentious development schemes. The first of these was the notorious referendum package, worth over 31 million, and is into about 700 largely unregulated projects across the country. They were inclusive in that they were not purely directed at their own supporter base, they were also aimed at co-opting Franklin and the support base of the smaller parties. Employment in the public service was used as a patronage tool to reward loyal supporters. Staff numbers rose by 45% and salaries by 30%. The government also announced a raft of social assistance programs such as the Bolsa de Maio. Now with access to oil revenues, the CNRT pulled out all stops in the 2012 election. Veterans and their networks were key to the CNRT's electoral success. The day after the campaign began, the government announced it would begin paying the pensions due to more than 27,000 veterans and their families, worth around 46 million. Veterans also received 78 million in contracts without a tender process. Many simply sold on to their contracts to third parties, meaning that this whole exercise in providing employment to veterans largely resulted in a cash giveaway. Then on May 30th, the government announced the launch of a month-long $3 a day work program with a budget of 20 million, 20 times the usual budget, covering every suko in the country. This program is usually implemented in the dry season when little farming was done, so people could participate. That year's program coincided with the harvest, so most people were busy and received the money without doing any work. The leak of a list of CNRT donors after the 2012 election campaign was also highly revealing of the source of CNRT's campaign funds and the logic of the government's procurement program. At a fundraising dinner in 2012, guests publicly pledged up to 2.35 million to the CNRT's election campaign. The top 10 donors were amongst the 10 biggest beneficiaries of government contracts. The spending strategy could be deemed a success as the CNRT increased their vote at the next election, including in a number of Threatland strongholds. All but two minor parties, the PD and Clientelist, were wiped out. So with the 2017 elections on the horizon, most people thought the status quo would remain. Guzmão was still universally popular, and the election was theirs to lose. Indeed, the CNRT fully expected to rule in their own right. One of the reasons for their confidence was that they spent a lot of money. We heard as much as $7 million. Now, Timor's elections have generated lots of discussion about, for example, how the parties will line up in parliaments, rivalries between Janana, Threatland and Timor, and so on. Which is not surprising, especially for Australians. Our elections are so boring, depressing, and we don't get parties like Kuntu suddenly appearing out of nowhere. But for me personally, I find the suko level much more interesting. Timorese elections are really fought out at the suko and Aldea level, and all the parties know this. While voting patterns at a regional level are fairly consistent between the major parties, at a suko or Aldea level, they're much more fluid, with some sukos changing hands at every election. Generic campaign rhetoric counts for little in winning votes. People want direct benefits such as jobs in the public service, for example, scholarships for their kids, or to give one of the many pensions. So voters are highly pragmatic. They'll follow the political preference of the person or people they think will deliver these benefits. At the suko and Aldea level then, very different promises are made by parties. The veterans' pensions, for example, are a product of this local level campaigning. So targeting 36 to 45 seats, as we heard, there are compelling reports they spent a lot of money. According to one CNRT source, they allocated 3,000 per suku, 500 per Aldea, and the standard fee for people to attend rallies was between $10 and $40. As stated, the CNRT lacks the same local level organising party apparatus as Threatland. While they have party militants, many of them were inactive and didn't get out past the main towns. Threatland's strength and CNRT's weakness in grassroots party activism is borne out by an IRI poll 2 months before the election. They found 65% of people said that Threatland were the most active political party in their neighbourhood, followed by the CNRT at just 12%. Without the same party apparatus to draw on, CNRT had to rely on recruiting local figures of influence, or brokers. Veterans are the best known form of broker, and the recruitment of veterans and their networks of followers was key to many parties' election strategies. However, we also found out that increasingly, chefs de soukous and other local leaders can be powerful figures of influence. One recent study found out that up to 42% of people in rural areas rely on local leaders for information. They also link their community with vital services such as health, education, and get them on government pensions. We were told that some chef soukous can command a voting bloc of about 3,000 or more, and they may switch party preference a number of times as a result. So in the absence of any real political debate between the major parties, harnessing these brokers continues to be paramount to mobilise voters. What became clear from interviews for the project was that the CNRT weren't very good at it. It didn't manage its brokers very well, and it didn't distribute funds very well. In one case, the CNRT paid a chef de soukous in Dili $3,000, and he ran away with the money and voted for Frecklen anyway. Also, in one suka, we heard that only 15 out of 230 registered CNRT supporters received funds, meaning that a number of them ripped up their party cards and went and joined Frecklen. The other factor, though, was a shift in priorities. They moved away from after the 2012 election, they moved away from the direct targeting of the electorate through cash transfers to a focus on the relationship with party donors. In 2010, two of the biggest donors and recipients of government contracts received a contract to build a national electricity grid. With no tender process or technical specifications, the project doubled in price and now delivers 5 times more power than peak demand. Nonetheless, the new electricity system was universally popular and these problems were overlooked. The same couldn't be said for a number of other projects. The MDG housing project, which you see there, is the most notorious. So in 2012, two local companies and also major CNRT donors won a $100 million contract to build 55,000 homes. There was no real tender process, leaving the impression the outcome was a foregone conclusion. Now, the job could have provided jobs to thousands of local people, in addition to spin-offs for local economies. Instead, the winning bid opted for prefabricated housing from China. With no real planning or community consultation process, the houses were mostly dumped on vacant land. Now, an effective approach to clientelism would have turned this into a vote-winning opportunity, with housing and employment delivered to loyal party supporters or to swinging electorates. Like most projects, though, the key motivation appeared to be a reinforcing of the relationship with the client rather than the consolidation of electoral support. And it goes without saying, development outcomes were never a consideration. The post-2012 focus on prestige or legacy mega projects has not delivered anything tangible either, despite massive amounts of investment. Of the ongoing South Coast project, for example, there's been little progress beyond the useless airport and the beginning of a highway, which has also started to fall down. The only beneficiaries of these mega projects have been foreign contractors and the politicians who act as their brokers. In Indonesia, they call this gouging. In return for contracts, you get party campaign cash, and the middleman gets a percentage, or woman in the case of Sedilda's mouth. Two of the biggest contracts in Timor now, Waskita Karya and Utama Karya, are past masters at this. They've both been charged in Indonesia for the very same scam. So in conclusion, the CNRT banked on Shanana's resistance credentials while hoping to buy popularity through lavish campaign funding and the co-opting of local figures, but it didn't work. Despite a massive level of public spending over the last 5 years, public funds were largely squandered on mega projects with little social outcome. They are poorly targeted in electoral terms, and so the CNRT missed the opportunity to further consolidate their vote. The move away from programmatic patronage or clientelism, such as the provision of social transfers or projects with tangible household level benefits, such as electricity, towards these mega projects came at the expense of the relationship with the electorate and the CNRT paid the price. So, to put it very simply, the people got this, and the party donors got this. Thank you.
The good part of being straight with the time is that we have 20 minutes for debate and questions. So please come to the table. So Karina,
Bom, a parte boa, né, da mediadora ser mais exigente com o tempo, é que terminamos então a mesa agora com 20 minutos para questões, para o nosso debate, né? Eu acho que temos várias possibilidades de diálogo aqui, as falas foram muito complementares, né? Então, nós temos aqui, na fala do professor James, algumas coisas que refletem na pesquisa do professor Michael, os dados aí de que o que os jovens estão querendo com o investimento do governo não chega. Então, está aí o que o professor James trouxe sobre o CNRT e esse gap realmente entre o interesse e o que de fato tem sido feito. A importância do suco nessa administração local e nessa construção dessa democracia, que também os sucos aparecem de forma muito forte nas 4 falas. A professora Sui também traz a questão do state building, da construção do Estado, da construção dessa paz e buscando isso de forma institucional, mas respeitando as instituições locais. Sorry, I'm just doing like a brief about to start the debate. Então, nós temos aqui várias possibilidades de análise por olhares diversos, né? Com temas democracia, essas disputas entre os 2 principais partidos, e essa importância da esfera do sul, que os professores trouxeram como a chave aqui do nosso debate. Então, a proposta é fazermos uma rodada de 3 perguntas, e aí depois a gente abre para mais 3, se der tempo. Então, já viu a Silvia, Sara e Suzana, por favor. Ok, eu vou falar português, é para o Michael, o Leach. Michael, no vosso survey, ou no vosso questionário, vocês tinham a ideia de, estavam a falar com mulher ou homem, porque tinham a questão do género. Mas não há nenhuma análise de género desses dados, ou há? E se não há, achas importante ou não que essa questão do género seja analisada para compreender melhor, digamos, a juventude, uma vez que ela é composta de mulheres e de homens?
I've got a couple of questions. Two for James. Whose house was that in that last picture? But also, how do you account for CNRT winning the last election then? Yeah, you don't need translation for me. But my other question for all of you probably is, I'm thinking a lot about the actual electoral system in Timor, and I've written a little bit about how it gives a lot of power to the male political elite who run political parties. But also the idea that local leaders don't get a place in the parliament. How do you think the electoral system in Timor sort of disadvantages different groups? And I mean, what do you think about that? I guess is my question. Yep. Where is this going next?
Sarah, what was your second question? Oh, I had my headphones on.
How would you account for Senator winning this election and if they do so badly?
So, well, thank you all of you for wonderful papers. I actually have two questions to Michael. The first, you don't need to be too detailed, but could you explain how these groups of students how do you maintain the same kind of representation from students that go from 2002 to 2017? And the second has to do with the ethnic groups' results. First, to understand what kind of expression in Tether you use to ethnic groups. How are the questions? And I'm wondering if you have this balance, constant balance between yes and no. I wonder why you don't introduce the question of both.
Teresa, sim. Tenho algumas associações sobre gênero nos meus artigos, sim. É uma categoria muito interessante para alguns assuntos, para entender. Para o mais interessante para mim foi essa atitude às líderes tradicionais. Há diferenças muito significativas entre os homens e as mulheres sobre este. Então, eu mostro este gráfico. Mas há outras diferenças entre mulheres e homens também nas surveys. E pode enviá-la a Kelly. Eu posso enviá-la a Kelly se está interessado. Está bem? E pode ler os meus artigos. Stand by. I feel like I should leave it to someone else. Oh, Susanna, well, while I'm talking, yes. The consistency of representation in samples, yes. So some effort is put into this. So from 2002 to 2017, I've done 5 surveys. And each time it's the same training, and we have the same Timorese manager who was a Timorese academic. And we have split gender teams. There's a certain number of men and women. It's Timorese who go into the field and do that after we train them, Timorese students. So they're moving among their peers, and we have set categories for what we want from UNTL, UNDIL, UNPAS, and so on. And those numbers are replicated each time. Each time we get a sample of 300, and there's normally been 100 from UNTIL, and then 50 from the other universities. Now I'm aware that's not a perfect replication of the same sample, but it's pretty good. There's some effort that is put into that. And we check the gender balance each time, and we check the district of origin balance each time. And I put a lot of effort into saying to the students, do not go and talk to people who are from your language group exclusively. And that's why there's a limit on what any individual surveyor can do. They generally have a limit of 50 that they can do. Otherwise you will get replication of certain groups and too many Mackay speakers and too many Togolese speakers and so on. And then we are able to check that when it comes back in. So that's the answer to that question. Actually, we don't have a lot of yes and no questions. Most of those are a Likert scale, which is strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, and then don't know. Don't know is not on the same Likert scale. But a Likert scale is necessary if you're going to do associations between those attitudes and the dependent variable, which is something like gender or age or district of origin. There are not that many yes or no questions. So I take your point though, because co-habitations, that we could ask both. In fact, a lot of the questions do enable a student to give one to first, second and third preference, or to tick more than one box. So, but yeah, I mean, there's always methodological issues to think about in a survey. And the other thing is that surveys are only so useful. You find out what people think but not why. And so it's really important to then go and do focus groups and to read your peers' work. A lot of the reasons why I ask certain questions is that I've read your work and I think your theory is probably right. Why don't we go and ask people? So what's interesting is that usually that confirms the qualitative literature. Very occasionally it doesn't, and that's very interesting.
Is this working? No.
It was before.
Well,
yeah.
okay. Great, thank you. Let me address the question of why did CNRT win in 2018 and the character of the electoral system. Firstly, I don't believe CNRT did win in 2018. What won was a pre-election coalition of three parties, the three parties who united in opposition against Freeland in the government formed after the 2017 election. Between them, those three parties who were CNRT, I think Liberty Sun, and PD, sorry, not PD, three. Yes, so those three parties formed an alliance in opposition, and after the 2018 election, were actually returned with one less seat than they had in the after the 2017 election. Interestingly, when the 34 seats as opposed to 35 were distributed, CNRT was the one party that lost one seat. But it doesn't matter. The alliance got across the line. So technically, the alliance, not CNRT, has won. But since the alliance has broken into its three constituent parties, CNRT holds more seats than any other single party in that three-party alliance making up the government. So they got across the line. But there's another factor now they're contending with, which is, and I'll let Rui talk about this because it's his area of writing, we now have a fascinating system of cohabitation with a threatened president. And the fun has just begun, is my impression.
Well, I think the fun has just begun and it will last for a while. Let me just go back to my youth years in the 60s and early 70s. There was a very popular book called Chairman Mao's Little Red Book. You remember that? It was very influential in the radical youth. There were short sentences from President Mao, and you should read them all and you should know them by heart if you were a real good Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist, Maoist. And I think it would be nice to have Mario Catiri's little, don't know, maybe red book, it would be okay. Because in 2001, he said, it's the government's job to run the government and the president shouldn't interfere. Now, either Luolo is not following Alcatiri's advice, which should be in that book, or he has changed positions, which I think he has done rather frequently. And so the results of the election doesn't mean that the alliance which was formed before the election must endure to the end of legislature. What endures is the number of seats each party has. And we may have different combinations. If this type of war between Shanana, who has written a letter to Luolo in the same spirit of his famous speech in April or May 2006, very critical of threatening and very ironic, and showing great disagreement, and the threat that he has now made to impeach Luolo on grounds that is preventing the regular functioning of institutions by not allowing formation of government, which I think is not grounded in the Constitution. He just can't do it. And even if he could do it, you would need two-thirds majority, and threatening would have to give one vote to achieve the two-thirds majority. So that's a part that's not going to happen for sure. But yes, now what happens is that it's the parties themselves and their seats and the combination of seats. And it's not impossible that one day Kaur Matanruak may find Mario Alcatiri more attractive than Shannon and change horses. It happens a lot in democracies which have parliaments, even if that's not fully parliamentary, but there is nothing against changing horses in these coalitions. So I hope I've been clear.
Sue, you actually stole my question there. But I agree with you that was, the CNRT didn't win. They actually lost votes. Looking at that, a presentation we saw a few weeks ago, by Alan Wall. He showed that their vote actually dropped by a seat. So what they essentially did was co-opt two other networks. And Baukau, PLP are basically Baukau and Dili and veterans networks. And Kunto basically have picked up all of those little ASDT and other smaller party votes across the kind of the spine, mountainous spine of Timor. ASDT always ran from AU and parts of Anaro right through to Manatuto. So that's what they did, and they've picked up. And now you've got 35,000 people who have sworn to, through drinking a concoction of blood, seawater and singed hair, bound to... Well, apparently 86,000 took the vote, so they're going to die now, of course. The ones who didn't vote for Kunto. The house is belongs to Cecilio Camina. He's a very well-known broker for Chinese and Indonesian companies. So he's one of these people who brings in the cash to the party, gets a percentage, and he's never, like many other people like Kalawadi, never done a day's work in his life, but somehow gets a mega mansion. And because of that's the importance he had to the party, although I heard he's now formed his own party, but that's another story. But the third question is incredibly broad, but I can say why don't local people get elected into national politics? Depends how local you mean. If you mean chef de sucos, chef de aldeias, no. But people like veterans, Ernesto Guru Fernandez, he's a very powerful broker in Amera. He delivers the vote for PE election after election. So he was number 4. I think Eliseti is another one. another guerrilla commander, best known for his tyre smuggling network and illegal logging business. And I think he was also quite high on the PLP's list. Party lists generally operate, Mike may know more about this than me, but what we heard in this project last year was that you get on the party list through A, being senior in the party, having some main position, being integral to the campaign in some way, B, through bringing cash to the party, bringing lots of money, and C, through bringing in, mobilising votes. So we heard that, for example, Thomas Cabral, I don't know if anybody knows who Thomas Cabral is, had to work with him. He's basically, I would describe him as a party hack, but he's a Leroy in, I think, Lakuba, and he brings in a huge slab of votes from Manatuto, and that's why he's there. So that's what you have to do, basically. It's not a merit-based system.
I was just going to add that the pre-election coalition, if you read it, agreement expires in a few days. It was only designed for 30 days after the election. So some people are putting that about as a fraud on the people of East Timor. I don't believe that to be the case. I think what they will do is a post-election agreement now. They're two separate things, but it is temporary and they formed their own bancadas already.
Just a little compliment on what James just said. I find that parties, although they benefit, the central structure of the party benefits from the closed list system, they also have an interest in having candidates from all districts to improve their chances. And if you look at the lists, they are not daily-based lists. They are not daily-based lists. They are lists of I'll give you two examples. Team now has no representation, but when it had representation, one of them was from Los Palos, and CNRT has always had Los Palos people in Parliament, not only in the list, 65 people on, but in their 20-odd seats. They always have people from Los Palos. They have people from most of the districts in order to improve their chances. So they are learning how to work with the system, I think.
E vamos ter mais uma rodada de perguntas, então já temos duas, mais alguém? Três, talvez consiga quatro. Bom dia a todos, a todos da plateia, a todos da mesa. I have a comment that is a comment and is a question at the same time. And it has to do with corruption and also with democracy. I think we are before very different narratives about the political system in East Timor. Some people are saying things are doing very well in terms of institutional arrangements. But at the same time, for instance, Jamie's presentation showed us things are very bad. So in terms of a distance, of having a big distance between the formal orientation of what is supposed to be a democracy and how democracy is in fact working in East Timor. So, but this is not exclusive to East Timor. This is happening here in Brazil as well, okay? So, all that we are seeing in terms of corruption here and there make me think about the place, how to make sense of corruption in the political system.
And because just to say that it is dysfunctional is this is not true. It's very functional, in fact. Okay, but now just in the case of East Timor, James, what do you and all of you think about that scale of corruption in Timor? Sometimes I feel myself in a very contradictory position. I feel like, okay, what we are calling corruption makes sense for people in terms of gift exchange. But I'm also conscious, and most of people who are, I think that they are not living just in a local basis society. They are inside a national and an international society in which these kind of transactions are not allowed. What are your intuition about the way people behave and how people feel towards corruption in their political life in East Timor? That's my question.
Hello. My question is actually very similar to Kelly's, but I'll just expand on it a little bit more. I was thinking how indexes and indicators, they say, are successful when they're no longer needed, right? And the question of duality, all of you addressed dualities and democracy, and whether or not dualities could coexist in a democratic system. And I was thinking that you even represent a duality, being foreigners analyzing a very, very local politics. And so, what examples do you see in the world of democracy working in a way that might be useful to East Timor? If we were to take our gaze and look outward, are there examples where capitalism does not win over traditionalism, for instance?
I just had a quick why question for Michael. I don't remember the exact data, but one of the last categories was indicated declining importance of going abroad, something like that. And you suggested that indicated optimism about Timor, and I was just wondering whether it might also indicate pessimism about the possibilities for immigration with the rise of anti-immigrant policies and politics throughout.
Thank you. I'd like to address a question predominantly to Sue about you made the comment about the community empowerment program, which was introduced during the UNTAI time. But my understanding of it was that UNTAI was not very happy about it. It was in fact a World Bank project, and there was huge dispute, and the World Bank sort of wheeled it in as part of a regional activity and an activity they'd been doing in Indonesia, and had planned to bring it to Timor as the 27th province. And I didn't really see it as a sort of prototype of local government so much as a way of getting money out around the country, because they distributed huge sums of money. Those Conselho de Suco that were elected were predominantly to vote on how to spend this money. And, and you said it's disappeared, but in reality it's come back in another form, which is the PNDS, which is the infrastructure project of the Timorese government, which is also being strongly supported by an Australian aid project, which you probably know more about than I do. And I'd like to ask really all the panel in a way to make a comment on to what extent can we still blame UNTAI and the UN when so many of the recent developments seem to really be taking place because of
initiatives by Timorese, and everyone's been describing things that Timorese are doing, and to what extent do you think you could still blame UNTIDE for making mistakes that have had a permanent impact, or is that by now something of the past? And just before I give up the microphone, I'll make a brief comment in the context of the discussion about who gets to be on the party lists, and point out that one of the people who did get on a party list is a former student of 3 of our participants in this conference, and she got number 15 on the Fretland ticket, a student of Janu's and is now an active member of Parliament, only graduated a few years ago. I've suddenly forgotten her name. Nelia Menezes, that's right. She's a former UNTL student, just graduated not long ago, and taught by the 3 of our participants here, and she's now in the Fretland Bankard. So, there are, and being a young woman is also a great plus, I think.
Okay. No, really interesting question, Kelly, and I would say that there is 2 different types of corruption to begin with. So one is this sort of very petty corruption. There is massive pressure on people to come up with money for different things. Like they're expected, if you have a job in the government, anyone with a job is, we've heard of external remittances, there's also internal remittances. So anyone with a job supports a large amount of people. There's requests for motorbikes, for university, school fees, so on. Ceremonial things, especially, you're expected to come up with the money, more the money than other people without a job for these kind of things. So it's massive, and if you don't give contracts to your friends and relatives and so on, I know people who've been ostracised, expelled from their families because they wouldn't engage in this kind of exchange. They can't go to family, ceremonies or gatherings. Then there's the other kind, which is just sheer greed, by anyone's estimation. There was I love reading Deloitte's reports. There was a Ministry of Defence report which described how a $6,000 invoice was changed to $6 million after just a bit of text and some white out. And this is just nothing. That's nothing on the scale of what we see. So like a $720 million seawall project. The audit chamber rejected it, said there was no due process involved at all. So what went on there? Like this is a kind of credible scale of corruption. We know the company was banned in South Korea from bidding for government projects because of collusion. So it gives us a sense of what went on in the awarding of that project. So there's 2 different kinds of things. In terms of attitudes, well, in 2000, there was a 2012 survey by the Anti-Corruption Commission which found that 60%, I think, of the population thought that the government was corrupt, but 60%, more than 60% voted for the government in the next election. So the paradox is that it's, like in many societies, it's about people getting stuff that you're not. And I went to many campaign meetings in the last election, and we also, the Bellum monitors, we gave them 2 survey forms and they recorded, amongst many other things, it was fascinating data. Amongst other things, they recorded the promises that people made at the Aldea and Suko level. So PLP, for example, Paragons of Virtue promised to get everyone on scholarships. Every household would be given a scholarship. And yep. And whether they qualified or not. But a common thing was all the different pensions. We'll get you on the pension. It's not a transparent process. You've got to be a CNIT or Fretland whatever to get on that. We'll get you on that. So there's this perception that other people That's what a lot of people, most people think that's what corruption is, other people getting stuff. They got a job, it's because they've got contacts. It's not because of, they've got a university degree and you don't. It's all about that. People don't really understand the meritocracy. So, and it's very hard to break that. And I don't think the last election, the 2017 election, my talk hadn't been so tragically curtailed due for time reasons. I would have gone into a bit more about the kind of promises made during that election, but also the basis of support for the PLP. It was 40% in Balcao veterans networks, and it's got they've always been pro-CNRT for reasons of purely for patronage, veterans pensions and so on. There's nothing else, it's got nothing to do with anti-corruption.
I might just make some very quick comments on the questions. I'm aware of the time. I think James is right. There is a certain scale of certain types of corruption that are just well beyond the metaphor of reciprocity. I think it's true, though, that at the lower level, Timor is a small society, and it's actually sometimes quite difficult to find someone who isn't somehow related to you to take up the contract. But that shouldn't become an excuse for what James is talking about, which is the really large-scale stuff, is really much more along the lines of Indonesian modes of governance, I think, rather than some sort of metaphor for the traditional. What I want to say is that it's very interesting watching the current standoff between the President and the Prime Minister around the issue of corruption. Corruption is the reason why the President has not appointed 11 of the Ministers, corruption investigations, I should say. I believe a couple have actually had trials. And the sense that I'm getting from the ground talk from a lot of people is that Luola's action is reasonably popular with the people. There is frustration about the Emma bot getting away with this time and time again. And so, though he's making a political move, it's one that was well judged, I suspect, and it's getting some popular support, and we're seeing this sort of tussle emerge of cohabitation, semi-presidential style. We're finally seeing that occur in the Timorese context, and corruption has become the issue on which that is first playing out. And so that's an interesting one, which probably goes to some of the popular frustration around the issue of corruption. Alex, really quickly, yes, I think some participatory models of budget decisions that we've seen in Brazil are really good ones, a sort of bottom-up decision-making. And that is tied in with, as Rui was talking about, the unfinished agenda of decentralisation in Timor. And to the extent that those programs have been a success, it's because on the very few occasions that they've gone and talked to the local people at the Suco level on what they want to see by way of development, those programs have been quite a success. I think it's fair to say compared to the others. So there's a model. Betsy, 20%, yeah, so that was just a figure of who is very willing to leave the country. And I couldn't help but notice that it dropped significantly from 2007 to 17, where it had been first 49 in 2002. 49% were very willing to leave the country if it would improve their life chances. After the crisis, 61, 3 in 5. And now it's down to 20. I am optimistic about that. Obviously, people that age want to leave the country. It's not a pathology. It's normal, but that seems like a more normal level now. And I guess I am optimistic about that. I think I'll leave Helen's question for Sue.
Yes, I'll touch briefly also on Alex's question. I think corruption's probably been dealt with very adequately by the others, but adding to examples where democracy is working, I'm not going to sort of headline, but like Mike, point to certain things that are helpful. And I guess the two areas I point to are really strengthening the accountability machinery in countries, irrespective of its system of government. It's looking for that external machinery, independent of the executive. In the parliamentary system, it's often machinery linked to the parliament, like an auditor general. In Timor, it can be the High Audit Court or CAC, the Anti-Corruption Commission. But it's strengthening the machinery that can tackle or constrain the orbit of the actions of the executive and review its orbit. And the other element of that links in very closely is try and maximise transparency around the actions of government. I think sadly the budget portal in Timor is becoming more opaque or less effective, but it was a wonderful initiative at the outset, to the maximum extent providing opportunities for citizens to see very closely what their governments are doing, so at least they then know what they're critiquing. On the Community Empowerment Programme, it was the first welfare programme initiated in Timor. It was certainly perceived that UNTAC was not happy with it. I've got no real sense of what that was about. I was a district administrator at the time and I was unhappy because I saw it as social engineering. And as a result, actually persuaded the mission to commission the piece of work that Sophia Spina and Tanya Jorge did, which was really looking at the way that local communities organise their relations and their decision making. That way, if we're going to try and meddle with local power structures through the distribution of funds, and then we should certainly understand what it was we were interfering with. I was actually fascinated that local communities were working around the rules of the Community Empowerment Programme very effectively, at least in my district. In terms of UNTAC's legacies, to the extent that it engaged in institutional design, that design did flow into the Constitution in many respects and has affected the way that the political system operates. But equally over time, a number of practices are emerging that are producing a local modification of the formal institutions.
Two brief comments. One on corruption. Unfortunately, corruption is something the vast majority of countries have to live with. If you look at the Transparency International Perception Index, I think that is called, Timor-Leste just sits where Southeastern Asia sits. It is not very different from Indonesia or Vietnam, which have substantially different regimes. It seems to be a cultural, in a sense, a cultural feature of the region. This is not an excuse, but it's to place what happens in Timor in a broader regional perspective. It is not very different from, certainly from what they experienced in 25 years of occupation, which it's certainly, I can't say that Portuguese colonialism was also corrupt in this scale, because the scale of the economy was much smaller. What Timor has been doing in terms of oil revenues, it has been meeting some international standards. There is some transparency indices of oil economies in which Timor doesn't perform as badly as it does on the general index of corruption perception. It does actually perform quite well, and they have been trying to put in place, but slowly, with a lot of pressures, the Court of Accounts. I think that's Tribunal de Contas, the Court of Accounts. Portugal helped there, and I personally know quite well the technician who came and reported the difficulties because of the general public acceptance of what by law, by rule, is considered corruption. And that was our main dilemma, that there were breaches of the law that were widely accepted as legitimate. And this is one thing that has to be taken in consideration. As for this last aspect, Sue mentioned about UNTAED political model being absorbed by the Constitution. The one thing I guess is that UNTAED was convinced that threatening was the most structured, well-organized party, the only one capable of running an independent country, and organized things. For instance, there were hearings about how should we produce a constitution. And the only people who proposed an elected Constituent Assembly to start the process was threatening. Everyone else suggested other forms. But Peter Galbraith and Sérgio Vieira de Mello even went to New York and presented two ways. But Peter Galbraith, the man in charge of political affairs, said, no, the only way we have to legitimately hand over power is to elect right away, give 2 months for parties to formalize, to organize, which obviously threatening was formalized, was organized, and the others wasn't. And in a sense, I think that UNTAED was clearly aware that the results would be a threatening landslide. If anything, they were surprised by the level of votes not being as high as 80%, as many suggested at the time. But you were there, I wasn't. But the feeling I get is that that's the only point in which I'm not sure if I follow you completely, is this one.
Oui, sorry. Sorry, but the time is over. We have a very nice and a very productive discussion here. Thank you very much for you all, for the public, and we will have just 45 minutes for lunch to the next session.